Hello, this is Phantom Electric Ghost, and we're live on the air with Venchele St. Deek, and wanted to welcome you to the Phantom Electric Ghost podcast. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing good. How are you doing? And thank you for having me here today.
Well, it's great to have people from all over the world. We've been talking to people since 2016. We're actually at episode 1035 with this episode, tracking on Apple Podcast since 2016. And want to let people know that if they can go out. We actually have the link to your main website, which is pathwaycoachingwriting.com. That will be fully clickable when we're published. It's not clickable while we're on the air, but people can check that and they can directly connect with you there. We'll also let people know that we are a featured podcast on the Newsly network, and that's an audio only network. You see the icon up there, and anybody uses that coupon code of Ghost can check that out for 30 days for free and check us out because we'll be on there later tonight on Newsly with the audio version of this podcast. But again, thank you for being on the show. And we're going to talk about the main topic is a writer's journey from the blank page to a published masterpiece. And maybe you can introduce that story by giving people a bit of background about your life story.
Absolutely. So when I think about my life story, because this is a story that continues to evolve and to change, to be honest with you, because as I grow as a person, I feel like it is my responsibility to start thinking about, what is some of the key elements of my story that have made me who I am today, and what are the areas where I need to, continue to grow and to learn from others. And I think this is very much tied to the conversation that we're going to have today about going from a blank page to a masterpiece. I know that analogy is, based on writing, but again, the writing would not come to it will not come to fruition, or it's not possible if we don't do some self-reflection. And that's what my life has always
Mm-hmm.
been. I mean, I was born in the States, but I grew up in Haiti. My family's from Haiti, Martinique, and France. I spent, my formative years there before coming back to the States. And to be honest with you, writing is something I stumbled upon because I grew up in a family where people are very, very much patriotic, but um, also instilled in me this love for learning, this love
Mm-hmm.
to read books. And so I think when we're talking about going from a blank page to a masterpiece, we're also talking about, my love for reading as well, because that's where I was first exposed to words and the power of words, and how it led me to a career doing a business, from my for well developing pathway coach writing, to help others amplify their voices in spaces that necessarily don't carve out um, they don't carve out a space for them, especially people of color.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I mean, when I started this podcast, I put a focal point on artists. And artists aren't just musicians, they're authors, they're writers, and even, people who create their own businesses. Entrepreneurs are creators, the creative type of person. And so
Yes.
I'm sitting in my studio with all my synthesizers. I'm a keyboardist, synthesis, sound designer, and I'm a
Oh.
software guy. I have multiple hats, but I've been playing since I was like 17. And it started with poetry. I started, reading Dunbar and reading the Harlem Renaissance. Then I got into the Victorian poets, and I was like, I'm a child of the '70s. I'm 56, so I grew up
Mm,
loving, funk music, jazz, fusion, rock, everything. And I said, what I liked about the old '70s music, it was easily kind of you could be transparent that there was a lot of poetry in the lyrics, there was a lot of storytelling in the lyrics. If you could go to Bob Dylan, Hendrix, Doors, like all that stuff, Beatles,
mhm,
it has a lot of depth. Stevie Wonder, I mean, it there was a lot of depth and a lot of thinking about like what you're trying to you create these sound paintings or these sound movies. And I was always very entranced by it. And I felt like,
mhm.
musicians are like writers because they are writers. They just
They
write
are.
in a shorter form. It's a shorter form, but it can still pull you in like a novelist. And so I was very much interested in anything creative. And it does start from, scribbling on that notepad or that napkin, and then it turns into a project and turns into a song or turns into a poem, turns into a book. So I've always been interested in that process. And I'd like to learn about like how you love reading translated into you wanting to write your own material. When did you feel that you could write your own material? Because a lot of people have this kind of imposter syndrome where they feel they can't be a writer because Hemingway's a writer, Shakespeare's a writer, all these people are writers, but I couldn't be a writer. Did you feel like there was anything like that, or you felt like, well, I could do that?
I think at first, I definitely had imposter syndrome, but that's because at the time I didn't have the words to really say no to, people probably I met on the path who were not very supportive or very critical. But
Mm,
then when I matured, I realized that my environment is a reflection of my inner thoughts. And so I sincerely think that the reason why maybe I didn't receive much support in terms of writing my own material at first is because I didn't even know myself, what I wanted to write about. I probably, even at the time, now that I'm reflecting on it, probably I felt like most people when they first starting out that they don't have a story to tell, but that's not
mm,
true,
mhm.
because you mentioned Hemingway, you mentioned poetry, and as soon as you mentioned poetry, I thought about August Wilson.
Mhm.
How he, his books are not like Harry Potter books, but it's packed, with a lot of life lessons, a lot of material that people can take, and then and that resonates with where they are, the challenges that they're going through, right? If you haven't seen the movie with Denzel Washington and Viola Davis,
Oh, I think you're hung up a little bit. Hopefully you come back.
yes, I'm back.
Yeah, yeah.
um at the time I don't even think that we had a term for that. I just felt that I didn't have a story to tell.
Mhm.
At the time when I stumbled on writing, which was around my teenage years, and we all know teenage years are the toughest years because you're trying to understand yourself, but then at the same time a part of you wants to fit in.
Mhm.
In my life, when I look back on it, I've never been able to fit in.
Yeah,
And I think that's the beauty of it. In order to write, when you look at these writers, even when you think about Edgar Allan Poe,
yeah,
they all of the written words that you see came from something that happened to them in their life. And
yeah,
so I began to, build self-confidence. I began to seek, therapy, to understand myself better. That's why I started us off when we were talking earlier with, in order to write, it definitely involves some self-reflection work, and you have to be able to deal with not only the positive but the places that need healing, like Ian Levinsent would say. I don't believe in good and bad, but I do believe in
mhm.
things that work for you or don't work for you. And I think that the imposter syndrome, it worked for me at the time as a teenager to propel me and to push me to understand myself better. But then when it came to writing, it no longer became, a useful accessory. And
Yeah,
I needed to remove
got
it
it.
so that
Well,
I could fly.
mhm.
I could fly and I could find my own voice.
Well, I always liked the Victorian poets too because they had this idea called the looking glass or the mirror. And, a lot of
Mm,
poets, if you go to Blake or Wordsworth, Tennyson, you know, Lord Byron, they're always talking about this looking glass. And that's basically the looking glass self is taking that stab of doing that self-reflection. And if you're a musician or an artist or a painter, you take that space, you get to this quiet space, you're in your area where you create your work, and you have that kind of quiet, and then there's a storm of all the things that come from the muse, right? So there's stuff that the thing about creative people, what I've learned is we have the ability to synthesize the internal and external. So we
Yes, we
take the
do.
stuff that's like the subconscious stuff that's going on, stuff that's at the top of your head, and then all this stuff that's outside. So you could have read the
Right.
paper, you could have heard somebody say something, you have a feeling that's in your subconscious, and you get on the keys as a pianist, and it comes out as melodramatic, or comes out, it comes out with passion. It comes out with some kind of emotion, and the keys represented in the words represented for an author. But if you're play an instrument, you have a couple of things you can do. You can use those frequencies to trigger the feelings that maybe you can't put into words. And that's why I always like being a musician, because I can use words, and then I can use those frequencies to kind of expand on the words, which is one of the things about being a musician I love. But I think it's the same feeling with, like, if you speak your words as an author or a poet, you can play with that frequency. You can play with how you present. And I think that's what people start to realize, like, that you have a lot of power as a creative person, how you present your stuff to the world.
Yes, I do agree with you, and I think, to complement what you said about frequencies, I wonder even now, how is that experience for people where who are trying to translate, work in their own from their language, their native language, to another language. How do those frequencies manifest for them, especially if they may not have strong fluency in English, for example.
Mhm.
Would the frequencies change, and would it impact the quality of the
Yeah,
final product? And that's another conversation that I'm always having with my clients, because the purpose of them even working with me through Pathway Coach Writing is not not necessarily. I mean, again, I never promise to deliver a New York Times best-selling, because I just think it's so I believe in giving people false hopes. And so I
mhm,
think that was the reason why I even created a business where I said, you know what, if you're going to work with me, you got to be intentional about doing this work. But secondly, you got to understand that, we're not seeking perfection here. And this is coming
mhm.
from a recovering perfectionist myself. There's it's a false sense of certainty that's
Yeah,
just not there. And I really help them hone in, like when you're talking about being a musician, I help them hone in on the process of writing. And I
yeah,
can only imagine, as a musician, you know your stuff, like, that whatever you're going to come up with is going to be fire. But when you're working on it, it doesn't feel that way. So you're just stuck in the process. You're stuck in the process, in like coming up with these notes, fitting these notes in a way that just makes sense, and that speaks to your soul, and that hopefully will speak to our spirits as well. And it's interesting that you were talking about, all of these musicians that you mentioned earlier, and also like the authors that you mentioned earlier. But I also thought about the Bible as well. The Bible, when we look at the Psalms, when we look at the Proverbs, these are hymns,
yeah,
actually.
yeah.
You
It's
know what
very
I
much
mean? And that's
musical.
the craziest thing, because even though I identify, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. I know you probably heard that many times
Right,
before,
yeah,
but spiritual in the sense of, for the longest time, when I was reading the Bible, when I was taking catechism classes, I never thought these were songs until I would go to church, and they would sing it, and I'm thinking, okay, this has a complete different
there's
feel
like a
from what I read
poetic
it.
meter. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the religious texts are kind of
Yes,
are basically they're poems. They're
yeah,
like
they
epic
are
poems.
poems.
They're like epic poems, and poems have a meter, and so they're very musical. And so,
Absolutely.
if you go back, to the Greek, to the Iliad and the Odysseys, and there's a lot of
Yes,
structure that's like that. It's very similar with multiple cultures. You go to Buddhist culture, Hindu culture, Japanese culture, like ancient Greek. There's a lot of patterns that are very musical. And
absolutely. Even in the writings of Marcus Aurelius and William Shakespeare, there's a melody
yeah,
behind it.
yeah, it's an epic poem. It's basically a structure that a lot of people don't realize how much epic poetry there is, right? And even when we talk,
Yes.
as a synthesis, I use oscilloscopes. and I can see the patterns of voices and notes and everything. And you can see that people are musical. Like when you talk, like if you get a public speaker that's very good, they actually have patterns that are very rhythmic that
Yes.
follow like melody.
Tony Robbins is one of them, and Barack Obama as well is one
Yeah.
of them.
Yeah, you can feel that. And that's when like I always got into this idea of the flow state. I'm very much not a perfectionist. As I got, when you're a musician, you first learn, you put like 10,000 hours in, like anything, and you figure you learn your instruments, you learn your craft, and then you have to trust yourself. So once you trust yourself as an artist, then you don't have to worry like what key am I in? What chord am I on? You know it, right? Don't question it. Is this that is there? It's like muscle memory. And so if you get to this flow state, you basically there are no bad notes. It's happy accidents, and you look at things as opportunities. If you hit a note you didn't expect, you don't say that's a bad note and I start again. You
Mm.
riff off of it. And a lot of jazz musicians are known for understanding this, like the Miles Davis, the Coltrane's, you know, the
McCoy
Herbie,
Tyner.
Herbie Hancock. They mention it. They talk about like I was in Herbie Hancock has this famous statement where he was playing with Miles, and he hit what was a perceived bad note. He thought
Yeah.
Miles was going to kill him, and Miles just took that note and changed the song. Went in a different path. The whole band went in a different path, and then later he was like apologizing. Miles said, "Don't got to apologize. That's how we progress. That's how we evolve the song. There's nothing wrong with that." And then Herbie's like, "Well, that was a life lesson. I don't have to be. I can live in a moment. I can have this free
Yes.
flow. I don't have to be so concerned about the next note. I can let it be. You know,
That's how
and
I
not
felt
obsess
when,
about it."
and it's interesting you talk about Miles Davis and John Coltrane. I think I added McCoy Tyner, who was a protege of John Coltrane. And then,
Mhm.
funny enough, like when I write, like I always have Bobby Hutcherson on. That's another one as well. So I'm a huge jazz enthusiast. Like, funny enough, even during the new year, the day before the new year, I'm gonna be attending a jazz concert myself.
Mhm.
So I'm really big. It's interesting you say that because each time I'm writing, even when I'm doing work, for my 9 to 5, because Pathway Coach Friday is my side business, but I have a 9 to 5 working as a public health professional. And I always have some jazz music playing in the background,
Yeah, that's
because that's the frequency I use to come up with the words that stuck, in the crevices of my mind, that are like begging to come out. So that's interesting.
But it's very what I like about it is that when you get into like experimental jazz or freeform jazz or fusion, or even the
Yes.
early bebop is like it's so expansive. Where classical music is cool and there's a structure. There's a structure to jazz too, but it's very freeing and the pieces do evolve.
But
And
it depends on the person who's listening to it, because
yeah,
there are some people, they are not as in tune with musical notes. So for us, it may be expensive, but for them, it may feel limited. It depends
mhm,
on how they're hearing it.
yeah,
The listener gives meaning to what they're hearing too.
that's true. But I guess the thing is, I bet the rigidity of a classical piece of like
Mm,
I got to keep it the way Bach wrote it or Chopin wrote it. They tend to want it to be a mirror of the original intent, where a lot of jazz pieces will evolve and allow themselves to change based on whatever the feeling is that night or the room that night or what that's what I always loved about kind of jam bands and blues and
mm,
jazz is that you allow somebody like I don't have to hit every note. I mean, if Frank Zappa even said that, like I'm a musician, I could play my solo exactly the way I wrote it, but he said it
mm-hmm.
was boring. Like I come out there and I feel that room and I change it based on what I feel, and that's a very
Hmm.
much a jazz kind of idea. And that you have a structure, but you allow yourself to feel the moment. And
Oh
I
yes,
feel that's
absolutely. The
very
flow
freeing.
that you're talking about.
Yeah, it's very freeing when you can do that. And some people don't feel good about that because they was like, well, that's not. I want to know what's expected. There's an expectation. They want to stay within the frame. They want to stay within a box. And I'm more of an out of box type of guy.
And I'm also an out of box type of person. I think that, as you're speaking, I'm even thinking about its resonance to, my public health career as well, because it could feel very rigid because you have these systems in place, right? But I'm trying to, to break the glass ceiling. I'm trying to prevent the glass cliff, as they, keep talking
Yeah.
about these days. And so it's interesting that even right now, as I'm thinking about it, like I am in a profession that has from my perception, a very rigid system, right, of established rules and order. And then I have a side business in writing where it allows me to, go outside of that rigidity,
Hmm.
and striking the balance between the two.
Yeah, it's like
Because
left
I
right
think
brain,
that's
left right brain type of thing.
what you say.
It's like a left right brain thing, like your logical brain versus like
Yes,
more
it's a
creative.
left.
Yeah.
Yes, but it also speaks to the fact that as human beings, if we allow ourselves um to be in the flow and not to conform, how freeing that can be. And sometimes that can be scary because now that's a bigger discussion on how people perceive change
Yeah.
and how people handle transitions.
Yeah, I don't like it. I mean, a lot of people don't like it. They say they like it, and then when somebody is on the bleeding edge, they
Mm.
the first response to somebody who pushes the envelope is like, "Well, that's not right," or "That's not in the canon," or "That's not been done before." So there's immediate kind of try to put it down. Most of the time, like all my heroes in music, Hendrix, when he did the feedback, he said, "Well, you can't do that. You can't put that on tape." And Davis, when he did fusion, said, "Well, that's not bebop. That's not real jazz." And so anytime somebody pushes the envelope, and Dylan, when he went electric, they said, "Well, that's not folk music. You can't do that." So the immediate response is always like, "Oh, you shouldn't do that." And so yeah. So if you're looking for friends, like if you're on that bleeding edge, a lot of times you get nothing but critics, but haters, and you have
And
to
that's and that's and that's
believe
what we
it.
were talking about earlier when you were saying to me if I've ever experienced imposter syndrome. Like, absolutely, who hasn't? And at the same time, you have to be willing to lose friends in order to do something that has not been done before. And even when you look at the people who are in power, or even people who are doing amazing in their fields, most of these people can only count like three at least three friends, or at least one friend. I mean, look at Oprah. She only has one good friend, Gail.
Yeah,
And that tells you something,
yeah.
because
Who's gonna be
and
willing
that
to push it? I mean, she pushes it. She's willing to put
exactly.
herself out there, so you don't get as many friends when you just don't go along to get along. I mean, that's the whole thing. Like, you go along to get
That's
along,
always been me.
and
Yeah.
if you go along to get along, like, you can be in a happy medium, but, like, when you push it, like, the thing is, it's a law of attraction. If I go push it and I put
Hmm.
it on there, throw it on the wall, I might not get people in New Hampshire to dig what I'm doing. But then suddenly there's somebody in Denmark, and somebody in Iceland, or somebody in the Netherlands, somebody in Australia that understands what I'm doing. Can I hit their frequency? So it isn't somebody that's always like right next to you. Sometimes you have to put it out there and believe in yourself enough to put it there. And then the
and
people
that's
will come to you, you know?
and that's what I've been doing all my life, and I've been grateful. Well, I'm grateful to have parents who have always taught me, especially my dad, to go against the grain. I think that the only thing I wish I had known at the age of 6 that that I didn't know, before, is yes, it's great to go against the grain, but like you said, you lose friends, you lose but to me, I don't like to say that I lose friends. I just lose people who couldn't meet me at that frequency,
Yeah.
because people are scared. There's some people out there who are afraid of change, and when they see you pushing against the grain, I'm sure that they also, it reminds them that there are some things in their lives that they need to push against the grain, but they're just not willing to put in the work. Or
Yeah,
if
it's
they're willing to put
discomfort.
in the work, they're just fearful of losing, losing support. But in reality, they're not you losing support. It's just the universe has a funny way of just, again, just sending you to others with the same or like-minded frequency, and then the ones who are not on that same frequency, it pushes them away.
Yeah.
And that's part of life. I mean, you imagine if the prehistoric age had not faded away, where would we be right now? I
Yeah. Well,
mean,
mutation
I
is
don't
everything
know
in
about
nature.
humans living with dinosaurs, but something had to happen in order for us to be here, right?
Yeah. Well, things happen in cycles, and then there's like, nature. Like if you go in a forest, you might think it's uniform, but when you really start looking at it, it's not uniform at all.
It's
There's
not.
there's so much progression happening with like the living beings tend to like mutate and go out
Hmm.
of, they don't stay in their normal state, right? They keep on mutating and trying to change into the next thing to handle the changes in the environment. And so
Mm,
we have, saber-tooth tigers, and like look how big they are. Look up at our cats. Look how small they got. They evolved to like it doesn't really fit for them to be that big anymore.
exactly.
And the birds, like where these dinosaurs were birds, and now look how small they are. They had to have changed to fit the environment. So human beings know that, but our brains have kind of overrode our normal other senses and made us into these comfortable things that we want to go live in a village, put it by the river. But that river floods, and then you don't know how to handle it when it floods. Well, you used to know how to handle it because you would move, but you want to stay there. You want to stay, even though you know it. One day the flood's going to come. You still think, well, maybe it won't come. Well, the old human beings, they knew it would come and they move in anticipation of it. But now you can't do that. You have so much rigidity, you can't do it. So I think people have to understand that.
Yes, no, people definitely have to understand that, and it's a quintessential question about evolution, and again, um, really brings us back to Darwin's survival of the fittest. What does that look like now, in the current situation that we're in, where we're not just talking about the current ecosystem that we're in, but also how global warming is eroding that ecosystem,
Yeah.
and how, with these rapid changes, like, can we keep up in terms of creating an atmosphere or an environment where people can live and people can thrive,
Yeah. Well,
because we're talking
yeah.
about these cats, these small cats, these lions, saber tooth lions you're talking about. Are these going to exist? If nothing else, and I think I was talking to one of my siblings about this. I don't know if you're familiar with Frosted Flakes. Now,
Yeah.
I think the bigger question is that bear that you see on the
Yeah. Yeah.
on
Yeah.
the Frosted Flakes, will it still be here in
Yeah.
2035? You
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. The problem we have is like the environment we're setting up with the high heat is conducive to insects and the bacteria and viruses, right?
Yes.
So, like, the logical thing is like you are making the environment more inviting to bacteria, viruses, diseases, and insects, things that humans don't like. You're going to make the world like better for them. If the world's better for them, then we have less room because they get more room. They
It's
get to
kind of
do,
like the body, the system, like, making your body less acidic and more balanced. More acidic versus being more alkaline, and
yeah,
striking the balance there. But, our atmosphere, our world as we know it, is out of balance. Like you
yeah.
said, it will benefit some other organism, but again, it's hurting us in the process.
Yeah, but people got to understand is like, well, that's not really optimum. Like the optimum state for humans has been in the last, 1,000, 2,000 years, but we have quickly eroded our optimum temperature of the planet to the point where the oceans are getting acidic, the
Mm,
insects are getting more prevalent, diseases are coming back, things that are melting from the ice caps that are bringing diseases that were around when the dinosaurs were around that we're not immune to. They're viruses that were around when they were around. They're coming back from the melting, and we have no way to fight those. And so because of greed and certain people's intentions, they
Yeah.
didn't pay attention to the balance. The indigenous peoples would told them there's a balance to Gaia, right? But you just want to make money, and you say, well, these indigenous people don't know anything. Well,
But that's the
they
cost
do
of
know they do
capitalism. But that's
they
the
do know
cost of
something.
capitalism. And then also with the fact that we have about 8 billion people, the cost of capitalism is that you're trying to keep up with that demand. And then you are overusing natural resources, which again is creating to that imbalance.
Yeah, it just makes everything out of balance. And what the thing about life is like you have to move toward the things that are going to be progressive. So the progressive things that are positive. I believe in the positive energy, negative energy. Well, if you build up too much negative energy, all you get back are negative results. And to get the law of attraction, well, if you do negativity, all you're going to get is a lot of negativity. And when people they don't look at the cost of what they do. They
Mm.
don't do the calculations like, okay, in the short term, you make a lot of money, you have a lot of power, but what does it do? Right? If it causes all this damage, well, that's karmic, and there's moralities, all kinds of things. But people just look at the short term aspect of what they do, and it's a longer term thinking that I think if you get into being a creative, it's like you start thinking about, well, what's the long term goal that I want to do with my life? Do I want to be like doing things that are positive for my body and my mind and my heart and my soul? Or do I want to be on some, you know, wheel just spinning to meet somebody else's expectations of what I should do?
That's a very good question. I mean, is this because when you were talking, I was thinking to myself, this is more of an individual question, but what about from a community perspective? You know, what can we do to what can we do to improve our planet?
Hmm.
Because it's going to impact us all, not just one individual. But you see, this is the after effects of capitalism.
Yeah. And then they just want to leave and go to the moon and go to Mars. Well, you're probably going to wreck the moon and Mars too. Because like if all you do is just go to the next place, you're just going to go from place to place and not learn anything. And
But
so there,
also it could be perceived as an act of recklessness. If you can't even take care of your own planet, you know, it's what is the adage, like the current behavior predicts future behavior? Was the
yeah.
same thing. Like if you can't take care of planet Earth, what makes you think that you're going to be able to do the same on Mars? I mean, I know there's no life on Mars, but still.
Yeah, well, we could have life there that we wrecked and we just don't appreciate because it's bacteria or it's virus or it's life that we don't understand. And so then you have kind of like, colonial mindset. You have a colonial mindset you've never addressed. And then you take that into the cosmos. What's that do? Well, that's
And
probably
does
bad
and
karma.
would you say that greed is part of the colonial mindset?
I would say it is because you don't consider what you do. Like if you don't consider the impact to animals, and you don't consider the impact of plants, and
Mm.
you don't consider the impact to the earth, Gaia itself, right? Then all you say was like it matters that I got my Wall Street result, I got my banking result, and so you think that that's fine, but look at the ocean, look at the air, look at all the animals that are becoming extinct. You're not measuring that. So so if you have that kind of mindset and you go to a planet like Mars, it's like just because you don't categorize something as human expectation of life or intelligence doesn't mean that that didn't have intelligence or life, but you didn't respect it here, so you're probably not going to respect it there.
Exactly. No, I do feel the same way too. But it's not just about protecting, you know, our environment. It's also about protecting the people as well. And there's the morality piece that, you know, Marcus Aurelius, you know, always talks about. Because I have been reading a lot of books on Stoicism. Actually, most of the presidents who have governed our country
That's all.
um, are Stoics.
Yeah.
And so I always struggle with that, to be honest with you, in terms of I know that I have to do good. I know that I have to forgive, you know, my neighbor 77 times. And yet at the same time, I could follow the rules. I could follow all the protocols. I want, but it does not mean that the other person you are working with is going to do the same.
Yeah.
And
Oh
that's
yeah.
the part that really nags at me. It's like, okay, Marcus, you want me to be this like all-time good person, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we will not experience war, that that we will not experience some of the atrocities that are currently happening. Like it doesn't make you immune to any of that. That's why I think like when we're talking about individualism, we also need to think about the public consciousness. How
Yeah.
can we improve and tap on that? Like, how can we make people care about things that they perceive as not important because it doesn't affect them?
Well, that's always worried. I always kind of point out to people, it's like, okay, like until you like, I know a lot of people they'll go do a GoFundMe, right? If they get a critical illness. But up to that point, this person said, "Well, I don't believe in healthcare, right? I don't believe that you should help, that you should." But then suddenly, if they get it, then they want their neighbor to help them, but they don't have any empathy until it happens to them. It's like the Brady Bill. The Brady Bill was like to outlaw guns. It didn't happen until the guy got shot. Up to the point that he was shot, he was for the NRA, and then suddenly he gets shot, and then it's like, oh, now you believe in gun control. Why does it have to happen to you to be empathetic? Why couldn't you have been empathetic before it happened? That's to
Exactly.
me the purpose to me of a it's not communist, it's not social. There's a point of human community and being a citizen and having some civil decency. So the
Yes.
problem I think with people today is like, well, my overall individualism makes me a better person. So if I can go and have all the guns and pollute all I want and say whatever I want, doesn't matter what it does, make me a better American if I can do what I want, rather than saying, well, what is it that you could do for your country, right? Instead of what it can do for you, right? Where's that?
Yes.
Where's how come the idea is that like I can be as selfish as possible and it makes me a great? How could that be great?
And then
You know?
look at how we're even thinking about it too. Like, I will be this if I accomplish this. When this could just be a continuum, of good deeds and of good actions, to achieve a certain goal. And that's why I don't believe in resolutions. I'm so sick and tired of this oh, new year, new me. And I'm
Oh, yeah,
thinking,
it
if you
really is.
didn't if you weren't going to take care of your health in 2022, like 2023, it's
What is
not
it?
like, 2023 has this, if it was a person like a magic wand and say, okay, I'm going to give you everything you need in 2023. That's not how it works.
Yeah,
That's why I believe in continuation of building habits. It's the same thing with writing. Some people I know who used to, who worked with me before, would say that, Venchele, I need to have at least 2 hours. I need to dedicate 2 hours to writing. And I'm thinking, we have 24 hours in a day. There
two
is no
hours.
way that you can dedicate 2 hours. And again, like I use strength-based, psychology when I'm working with my clients, and I'm all for it. If they can dedicate 2 hours, that's great. But the brain cannot, tolerate this extended period of time of concentrating on a given task. Even our attention span is becoming shorter and shorter. That's the
Right.
reason why, like, we were talking about reels, and I'm thinking, yes, that's why reels are very short,
Yeah.
because they're supposed to grab someone's attention, right? And
Mhm.
so that's why I believe, and I think that what's most effective, just like the book Atomic Habits, the author was talking about breaking, bigger tasks into smaller tasks. You may not have 2 hours to dedicate to writing, but what about 15 minutes? What
Yeah.
about 10 minutes? That's
It's
much more
sustainable.
manageable. It's
It's
less
sustainable.
daunting.
Well, yeah, I think the problem with people that I've met is like it's not they trying to build a goal that's not sustainable for what you're doing, right? So if you're in a world where you're getting pulled all over the place, 2 hours might not be sustainable for you. Versus like I live in New Hampshire away from the city, and if I unplug, I could probably dedicate 3, 4 hours to writing a song. because that's just what I do. But
Yes.
there's a lot of people, like if you have a different life and you've got a lot of friends and a lot of things going on, a lot of commitments, you probably can't do that. But if you want to stay in the game, you got to find something that you can do every day for like the next 20, 30 years, right? And so
Exactly.
if once you figure out how to do that for your body, for your mind, for your heart, for your soul, you find the practices that are going to move you forward. And usually it's like, it's not going to just be some 12 step or some things going to happen, flash in the pan diet. You have to be able to do it every day. And I've been a musician since I was 17 and I'm 56. And the difference is I love it. If I love it, then I hit my keyboard. I don't leave my keyboard against the wall. I actually play it like almost every day because I love to do it. And so
Yes.
it's not something that's like, oh, I don't know if I'm going to do it. Well, if you love something, then you tend to do it, and you tend to get better at it because you do it a lot. And
Exactly.
if it becomes a passion, it's not work. Like if I sit there for 4 hours working something out, it's not work, and I don't worry about it if it didn't give me something immediately productive, because it's like steps on a ladder, you know.
And also it has to do with, our neuro associations as well. Like you link, music, to pleasure. And someone else might link playing music as a burden. And so that makes a difference. That
Yeah.
definitely makes a difference in your experience, like as you're playing the keyboard and you're doing what you do best. And that's the same thing with writing. I think that I always have to, even myself, I'm not immune to it. I always have to check what my neuro associations are when it comes to different things in my life.
Mhm.
Because I think sometimes when you don't make the connection, it can lead, to delayed blessings. It could lead, to delayed, not delayed satisfaction, but your dreams are sort of put on hold.
Yeah, if you don't really know, like I get so many people that really aren't doing what they love, and they might say, "Well, my goal is to make $1 million." Well, what is that $1 million for? If the $1 million is you want to be independent, you want to be
How
able
are
to
you going to
control your,
save that $1 million?
yeah, it might not be the $1 million. It might be you want to be an independent business person. You want to be an entrepreneur. You don't have to be $1 million entrepreneur. You could be in charge of your own destiny, and you don't have to make a million. You could
But look
still
at,
have the result that you want, but you're not really stating what you really want.
but even when you were talking about not stating what you really want, w- um, the person, using your example, the person wants to make $1 million, but how come they're not talking about how to sustain that $1 million? What about these lottery winners? And I don't know, but
God,
when I look at the news, like a year later, the money is gone. So, okay, you get that $1 million, but how are you going to keep making millions past the initial million that you got?
it's all gonna be gone. But that's because they're not thinking about, they just using it to get like immediate satisfaction. Because we're like in the immediate satisfaction age.
Clickbait.
Yeah, like you gotta get 1 million likes. If you do a post and you don't get all the likes and all the views, then you stop. The thing with the people who get where they want to go is the dedication to their craft, the dedication to what they believe in. And if they like, if you do a podcast and say, "Well, I got to get 1 million views," if you don't hit it, then you stop. But if you do a podcast and say, "I want to talk to people around the world," and if I've talked to 1,000 people, then I've got like an hour worth of their knowledge in my head, and it's like having like more than what you get in university. And so
Yeah.
that in itself is the benefit. And then the Rolodex of all those people that you could talk to and connect with, and then maybe things come out of the blue. But it's a connection, it's a human social connection. That's the benefit. But if you didn't
And
see it
that's
that
and
way,
that's the
you know,
reason why I do podcasting, because it gives me an opportunity to meet people that I would otherwise not meet, when I go outside. And then most importantly, let's face it, if you're doing podcasting, no matter how much of an introvert I may be, I love to talk. I love to talk. I love to learn from people, and I want people to learn from me. And that's the reason why I do them, because like I said, what is the coincidence? Like what was the likelihood of us meeting if I was not on the same platform as you? in
Yeah.
that sense. I don't know. Maybe I could have met you down the street at Costco. I don't know. But but again, I think, part of the human connection is also this idea of being ready to be vulnerable,
Yeah.
being ready to be vulnerable and to bear witness to someone else's story and to bear witness to your own story too, because even as we're talking right now, like, I've learned so much from you. And then I'm thinking, okay, well, there's more questions that I have that I need to reflect on after the conversation. And that's part of evolution,
Yeah.
evolving as a human being, right? um
It's
Again,
like
and
the
very
oral
much relate
history.
to what we're talking about, going from a blank page to a masterpiece.
Well, I think there's like, the reason you go to college is you get all that, like, you're listening to your professor, but you're also that learning experience with your classmates and learn how to socialize. It's the whole experience of that kind of goes back to the oral tradition of education is like, what do it's an oral history. It's the oral history that was passed down from elders. They're teaching you the oral history before they were books. People would go and they'd speak out these fables and they figure out these mores and they teach. And that's what people like the podcast because it's kind of like very old school. You're getting a human being direct conversation with less like fluff on it. You're getting like to the core. And that's why I like to do the live podcast because I don't have to stop and start and somebody say, "Oh, I didn't get that right." It's like, no, we're not trying to do that. We're trying to get the real point in time flow state connection, which
No,
we
we
did.
are, with the added the added ahs, the aha moments. Like, yes, absolutely. Like, I'm all for it.
Yeah, and so many people are into perfection. And I meet so many producers that like they don't want to take the early take of a song because oh they made a mistake or I hit the mic or I hit a belt buckle and so I picked up on it. But a lot of times in the past, if you listen to old recordings, they have those things in them. Like
Yeah, they would pick up on all the outside noises.
yeah, and it's like
That's
it
true.
doesn't sometimes it doesn't distract because you get closer. There's this adage in music production, like the first couple of takes is closer to the original intention of the artist. The further you get away from them, you start to edit yourself. You start to kind of destroy your work because you start to overthink it and you start to ruin it. And if you can stay closer to the original takes, you're probably going to be closer to the original feelings that you had. And so you can end up a lot of artists will end up in with too much perfection is they destroy the original song. They destroy it, and then producers and engineers say, "Oh, this early version is so much better. You really should go with that." And
But
and
it also too, like, it's also our attempt in a way to be in the flow, which is what's been going on for the past 47 minutes. Like, we've been in the flow, like going from one conversation to the next. Like, there's a flow to it. And that's what you want to preserve in every conversation. So I agree with you.
yeah, and there's so many people that they spend so much time editing. So they do one podcast and they edit it, and then they can't do. I could do 3 or 4 podcasts a day because I don't edit them. I let them be what they are. If I spent the time editing them, I couldn't do them. So I make the decision that I want to talk to more people, so I do less time editing. Other people like I want to present this glossy image and it's marketing. That's fine. That's what you want to do. But it's like, is that really going to get to the heart of what you're about, or is
And
it
then
just
also,
trying to?
does it preserve the integrity of
Yeah,
the conversation too? I'm not sure. With too much editing, you could lose the essence of the conversation.
yeah, because you're looking for with AI and everything today, people are so into trying to find a perfect statement. They're reviewing what they did. Oh, that's the perfect. Well, what they said, you're taking out of context. You didn't have the what was before so I don't know if that's the best thing, but the tools let you do it. And I've always said just because the tech lets you do it doesn't mean you should do it.
And
Yeah,
and then also too, even if you edit it to, till kingdom come, let's face it, you present the material to 10 different people, they're going to interpret what you say 10 different ways. So it
yeah,
doesn't, it's almost like you are working yourself to exhaustion,
yeah,
because regardless of whether or not the video picks up some outside noise. Some people may be like, oh my goodness, this is exactly what I needed to wake up because I was falling asleep here. And I needed to hear that, I needed to hear the sound of the tractor. I needed to hear the cat,
Yeah.
okay, in the background for me to say, okay, like I need to pay attention to this, and I think it's a bigger discussion on, sometimes there's some things in life that we may think that we don't need, but again, we're not in the shoes of the person who's going to be listening to what we have, what
Yeah.
we have to say. And it may just be the right element, the right factor, to take that person from one phase to the next, right? And so it's interesting that we're having this discussion today on that.
Well, I think also it's like a lot of times it's like if once you create something as a creator, you don't necessarily own the interpretation of what the reader or the listener how they
You do
perceive.
not.
And a lot of times people want to be control freaks. They want to say, I want to control that. I want this is how you should take that. It's like you have to kind of let that go. Like when I'm a creator, it's like you move on to the next thing, and that's what it is. Like I move to the next project and people will interpret, but some people will take that project. So no, no, no. You need to look at it in this lens, and they spend all their time trying to control the lens, trying to control the focus. It's like you're probably shooting yourself in the foot because if somebody gets that and you didn't even think about it, like you could get an opportunity that you're actually eliminating because you want it to be so narrowly received that you're not open to all the interpretations that you might get a film deal. You might get an advertising deal. You might get an opportunity to work with this person, but because you're trying to say, well, that's not that, that's not this, it's like, why don't you just let it be?
No, I understand where that, how that could be interpreted. And you also have people in life also who want to control their environment as well without realizing that sometimes the four walls of someone's house does not even protect them.
Oh yeah. Yeah, definitely. You have sometimes you don't have control, and you have to kind of
Sometimes you don't have control. People don't want to hear that. And you know what? To be fully transparent, I was one of these people at some point. Even when I was taking risks, even when I was always pushing the boundaries and going outside my comfort zone, there was always that fear of losing control,
mhm,
and what that would mean, to my character, to my personality. But I can tell you, as an adult now, in this whole adulting phase, um, you'll be damned if you do, and you'll be damned if you don't, like Dale Carnegie would say. And I think that, once you let go of people's perception of you and you do what feels good to you, the relationships will come, the opportunities will come, the ones that are right for you.
yeah,
um and I think that it's a beautiful thing to have arrived to that segment, right, on the spectrum. But there's so much more for me to learn. It's so much more for me to learn. And then, like I said today, you've given me a lot to think about,
well,
which is good.
you're never done learning. It's like people are like, well, even if you go get all the degrees and you go get your PhD, what you find with like in my day job, I'm a software designer.
Okay.
Since I started, the technology shift exponentially, right? So I can't go rest on my laurels. What I knew in 1978 is what I not I is a good reference, but it's not what we do in 2023 and 24. So our tech changes exponentially now. We get new concepts, and we can't just rest on our laurels. It's like we're constant students. And so
Mm,
the problem I have with the modern world is kind of in this situation where people kind of need to be a constant student, and then people want to be done. Well, you know
mm.
what? That degree is like really not done. You're constantly going to learn new things, and you're not really ever done till you're not here. And then you go to the next phase, and you're not done there. So, so the people who want to be complete, they're like, "Oh, I can't handle that." But like, well, that's kind of what it is.
No, that's true.
It's hard. It's hard for people who want to be done, because they want it to be complete. Like, it's a work in progress.
It's always an iterative process. I mean, even as I'm pursuing a doctorate in public health, a DRPH, they remind you of that in the program. This is an iterative process. Not even your dissertation is not meant to be perfect. It's a rough draft. And then, there are folks who will publish their dissertations and turn them into books. Or who knows, maybe in my case, turn into a podcast, who knows? But
Yeah,
I
there's so
think
many opportunities. I mean,
there's so many opportunities, so many
I mean,
opportunities.
yeah, I mean, in science, there are rules and laws, right? And we end up having theorems and we change them as we get more information. So it's like, oh, you can't go faster than light. It's like, oh, maybe you can, and
Maybe
so
it depends. It's
yeah,
all, the limitation is definitely in the mind. I mean, I recently have been listening to Neville Goddard on the law of manifestation, and some of the books that he's published. And again, like, I think the limits that we put in our lives, sometimes, are mirrored back to us in our environment. And if you're not careful, you may miss the mark. You may miss those signals. And the way I see it is that if you don't like how something looks, change the way that you look at it.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and I think that, again, like, as part of the conversation that we've been having, it's we always have to question our thoughts, and we always have to question what's being mirrored back to us, and change it accordingly if we want to have a different impact on people, and then also feel differently in our lives, because we only have one life to live.
But the
And
paradigm, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of paradigm shifts that come from different
absolutely,
perspectives. So if you have a like the stoic thing and you're like the canon cannot be challenged, right? So like there's a canon of like intellectual thought, and there's these titans in that canon, and if somebody challenges that, well, that's wrong. But what you learn is like, no, it's not. There's a lot of things that there's gray areas, and you might have like a preconceived notion or a prejudice or like a tendency to say, well, no, I'm not going to look outside of this. And if you have more open perspective and you listen to other people's arguments and other people's statements, it's like you just don't dismiss them. You
you don't.
start to understand, it's like maybe I had a limitation that has to do with me, and this person's in a different place, and maybe I can suddenly, with the law of attraction, get brought into that plane or brought to that frequency, and like, oh, I was in the old frequency and now I'm on a new one.
And even when we're talking about being an expert, we always have to be, at least I'm very mindful of its connotation, when I use it, in different audience, use it in front of different audiences. Just because you consider yourself an expert doesn't mean that you stop learning too.
Hmm.
Because even being an expert could be a limitation in itself as well, depending on the individual. Some people may think, you know what, I don't want anyone, call me. Like, for example, there will be some folks who will say, I don't want, when you're referring to me, you have to use a certain label, next to their name, Dr. So and so, Dr. So and so. And that's not what life is about, because there are plenty. I mean, again, that's why you have Netflix shows, right? This uncovering people who call themselves doctors, but they are frauds. So we have to be very careful, like, with these terms and labels. Like, even for me, even if I know that the degree is going to make me an expert in X, it doesn't mean that I stop learning. And
Yeah,
it
yeah,
doesn't also mean that it limits my curiosity to learn something else.
yeah,
We have to, and that's why I think, like, those conversations are important, so that you can get a different perspective, and that we can all understand that the institution of thoughts, has to change over time if we want to see sustainable impact in
yeah.
our lives and in our environment.
You do need some humility in the canon, like
You do need humility in the canon.
yeah, because if you don't have it, then people won't be open to the next phase, because a lot of times, like a lot of this stuff is from the 17th, 1700s, 1600s, 1800s. It's like we're not in, and so it's not that we don't learn from old history, but some of the things are not, that's not the current state of the world. And so
It's
then,
not the current state in the world, but remember, there would be no new school without the old school.
yeah,
So
you
we
have to, it's a
innovated
foundation.
from the old thoughts.
Yeah, it's a foundation, but you can't. Sometimes the foundation you have to look at, like, what is the basis of that foundation. If you look like us, sometimes we weren't in that foundation, right? So
Exactly, we were not. We were actually. I mean, again, I don't know if you've seen the documentary or docu series. Oh, I forgot. It was with Dr. Henry Louis Gates. If you
mhm,
remember that show, like where
mhm.
he was trying to help like some celebrities find out w- where they come from, their
Oh,
tribes.
oh yeah, 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 yeah,
And at a certain point, you realize that it would have been difficult for them to find accurate information because most of the archives didn't have names of former slaves.
yeah. It's hard. It's all the master's name, and then you have to. A lot of it's wiped out, or they didn't keep it, so you don't have the original name,
You
unless
don't
you can
have the
figure out.
original name. And
You can
and
figure out what
so
boat they came off of, and if there's some record from Dutch India Company about like where they came from, on a boat record. The insurance policies might have some. They started finding these insurance policies. They might have some details in there that were more specific, but still, then
and
they,
that's if the slave owner kept the names, like recorded the names of his,
yeah,
of his
he might not
slaves
have done it.
too.
He might not have done it, because
M-
he might have done it for the insurance company, but maybe not, because we like I found some of those records because I was working for some of these insurance companies, and they actually have the slave policies, and they're property policies, and
Yes. And that's the reason why I think at a certain point in the docu series, like people were just I don't want to say Dr. Gates was making guesstimates, but in a way, I think they had to make some guesstimates because they didn't have access to the information, or these insurance places didn't have
they have
the
everything.
information needed.
Yeah, you have to extrapolate. You have to do like genetic testing, try to figure out where you might have come from. What part of Africa is West Africa? Is these? What part could you have come from? And
Yes.
there wasn't a respect for the culture. So if you don't have respect for the culture, then like the people who create the history, they kind of own it, right? So if they didn't respect it, then they didn't write it down. The victors kind of control it. So that's the kind how it works. But we kind of back into it. I found some stuff that where my family we kind of found out where we came from, but we had to do a lot of work, and we weren't getting a lot of help. We had to do a lot of work.
And
But
and and that's how I felt too. Like even when I took the 23andMe uh DNA test and then found out that I'm like 20% European and then 86% um is it West African?
mhm,
And then I think a majority of the percentage was in, for Nigeria. And I kept joking to myself, like, I kept like saying to myself, okay, like, isn't that interesting? Because I took this test before the pandemic, and then now they broke down like the West African label into actual tribes. And then I found out that I'm Yoruba. And I'm like, well, they didn't have that before. But you
yeah,
see,
now
like
they're
you
breaking
said,
it
like
down more.
there wasn't a lot of help, but we had to do a lot of work.
Yeah, yeah. And now they can break it down because the genetics is getting even bit tighter. So now you can get a lot of information and find out, exactly where we come from. And it started to like tell people about the respect. Because generally there's a lot of disrespect for the other and kind of like cultures. And so anybody, whether you're Eastern culture or Western culture, if there's an other group that's been kind of pushed down, there's less respect for that other group because they're not in the status. It's all about the status of the class of the society and
But who defined the statuses? Who
but the victors,
defined the class system?
the victors, people who created a structure. So if you create the
Yes.
capitalist structure and you say, you know, the property doesn't have the structure, doesn't have the weight. Like if you're a property, well, you probably don't have that much weight if you have to. That's how you're looked at. So, and you have to consider like if that mentality is still around and you've never really
Mhm.
tried to challenge it
Yes.
until like the 60s, like really the 1950s and 1960s, we started challenging the structure. So people are like, "Oh, that's been enough time." It's like, really? So how long did we not challenge it? And it's like a very short amount of time that we've kind of pushed on it,
Right.
but and people want to act like, what's too much? It's too much. Like, I don't know. I don't think it's too much. That's personal opinion, but it's great having you on the show because I think and we'll be able to talk about a lot of things. We kind of ranging because tends to be where I go. But I hope you had a good time. We kind of hit our time mark a little bit
I
past it, but
did. I had a
and
great time. I had a great time. I'm hoping this won't be the first and last collaboration for sure.
oh,
But it
we
was
love to have
great.
people. Yeah, we have people come on the show multiple times. Like if we like with the pod match, they only let us come, set it up once. But I set up calls out. The first call might be through pod match, but if we click, then I have people come back through my other means like Calendly, whatever. But if there's always an opportunity to come back and talk on our show because we've done that over the years. So if we
Absolutely.
have a cool vibe, then we keep it going and we talk again at some point. But thank you again for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.